Acknowledgement. Attendees to this webinar are logging in from many different places. We invite you to take this moment to reflect on your own relationship to the land and peoples where you live. Edmonton, where I'm sitting today, is named Amiskwachi Waskahagan, which means Beaver Mountain or Beaver Hills House, in Nihewan, which is Cree, and is located on Treaty 6 territory and is home to Métis. The city is a traditional and present gathering place, traveling route, and home to the Nahia, Nisitapi, Métis, Nakota, Dene, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Inuit. My co-panelists are in Mohkinstsis, I hope I said that right, Calgary, which is within Treaty 7, home to the Blackfoot Confederacy, and the Otanesville Sauk Métis, and Winnipeg, which is within Treaty 1 in the national homeland of the Métis. We recognize the historic and current role that education plays in colonization and commit to working alongside Indigenous peoples to build a better public system for us all. So I'm Bridget Sterling. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta. The other presenters tonight are Dr. Isla Yun from University of Manitoba and Heather Ganshorn from Support Our Students Alberta. So I will pass it over to Isla to start us off this evening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bridget, and welcome everyone. So I'll start with what is the public education exchange question. The Public Education Exchange is an advocacy group. We advocate for public schools that are equitable, accessible, publicly funded, and democratically governed, and pursuing the common good. We also invite scholars and public education advocates and members of the public to create and share knowledge about education privatization and its impacts on social inequality and the common good. And you can explore more about us on the website, and we'll talk more about this at the end as well. Next slide, please. Yeah. We also engage the public in policy dialogues about education privatization, and some of you have probably participated in some of these using the World Cafe approach. This approach helps to engage participants in the exploration and discussion of topics. It also fosters mutual learning, and this approach facilitates solution-focused discussions. Next slide, please. And in this work, there are many theories, but we're not getting to this too much tonight. But just want to briefly mention that we draw on a critical policy geography perspective to understand and theorize about education privatization and marketization specific to the context of Edmonton. So we ask and explore what roles, responsibilities private actors are increasingly playing in education. How do the education systems draw on market principles like competition and incentives in administration, policymaking, and leadership? Who benefits and who loses from education privatization and marketization? And how the geography, so specifically in our World Cafe, we were trying to draw on sort of the experiences of Edmonton and what's going on in Edmonton to learn and about what's going on with education privatization and marketization. And yeah, I think that's a good place to end. We'll talk more theory later.
So I'm just going to give a little bit of context about Edmonton. I know we have a few people in the audience who aren't from Edmonton or from Alberta. So like the rest of Alberta, Edmonton's public school system includes both a secular public school board, a separate Catholic school board that is publicly funded, and a francophone options. And within any of those, public and Catholic, there's also French immersion. There's also programs of choice. There are fewer charter and private schools than Calgary has. So I think we didn't really delve too much into the differences between those. But Edmonton Public School Board has historically supported alternative programs of choice within their own schools, whereas Calgary's board has tended in the past to, for instance, say no to religious schools that wanted to become faith-based alternative programs within the public board. So there are a few differences like that. However, in 2020, the UCP government passed the Choice in Education Act, which had a whole bunch of things in it, but relevant to tonight's conversation. They removed the cap on charter schools, which are privately operated but 100% publicly funded schools that are sort of, we're the only province that has them. They're kind of an American thing. And since that time, at least three new charter schools have opened in Edmonton post 2020. They also removed the requirement that anyone wanting an alternative program must first approach the public school board. So now people can set up a charter school without first trying to have that be a program of choice within public schools.
Great. So a bit about our methodology for the Edmonton World Cafe. So a World Cafe involves structured conversations and a collaborative learning process. Um, so for our event, we drew on existing public education networks, including parents, caregivers, education advocates, and current or retired teachers, education workers, administrators, professors, and school board trustees living in and around the Edmonton area. We've kept the specific demographics of our participants confidential because of the small number and the close-knit nature of the education advocacy community. So during the evening, our 14 participants moved through 3 different table groups, and each time they discussed a different question. And we'll go through those 3 questions in the following slides. After each group conversation, each table is invited to share their insights within their group and then share their insights with the room in a whole group of discussion. Participants had a paper placemat to record their ideas on. And so in a standard World Cafe event, these mats stay on the tables and new participants would add to each one when they moved to a new spot. However, because we wanted to be able to analyze our data by participant, people took their placemats with them as they moved. The groups also recorded their group insights on poster paper. So at the end of the night, we collected all of these materials. The placemats were thematically coded, with each team member coding 1 question, followed by a group review. And then the process was supported by team members' notes, insights from the event, and the content of the posters. I also want to note that World Cafes are not specifically designed to be used for social movement mobilization. However, they can be starting points that use knowledge creation and sharing to enable participants to identify shared interests. And as we'll see later, some participants' responses suggest this kind of event could become an important part of movement building. Sorry, I'll pass it over to Heather.
Okay, so the first question that we asked those in attendance was just to describe what privatization looks like in your contexts and think of specific examples, consider your multiple roles. So some people were researchers, professors, students, parents, community members. And so there was some discussion around that. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so there were a few themes that emerged from that. A big one was the underfunding of public schools, which has been really acutely felt in Alberta's urban areas in the past couple years. There was some commentary that it seems like this is a tactic to manufacture a crisis, and then privatization is offered as the solution when the public school can't meet your child's needs. The funding follows the student rhetoric is a means of defunding public education as private options proliferate, was kind of a theme that emerged. And then there was a concern over the lack of public governance and accountability in private and charter schools. So private schools, for those who aren't aware, in Alberta get 70% of the per student base funding that public schools get. So when you choose to leave the public system and go to a private school, you are in fact taking your dollars with you. Charter schools have their own boards that aren't publicly elected. They get 100% of the public, and they kind of try to straddle the line of depicting themselves as public when they want public dollars, and then sort of marketing themselves as sort of a more private style option to parents. Um, so this is all seen as a bit of an unfair playing field because private and charter schools do practice selective admissions. People commented on that, and can cap their enrollment. So obviously we had a self-selecting audience at this event, but there was a really good understanding of the nature of different types of schools and the extent to which they're private. And then yeah, so next slide. There was also discussion of other forms of privatization, such as cost shifting to families. So we don't always think of that as privatization, but it really is when we are asking private citizens to fund more of the costs of their children's education. So when we raise school fees, sometimes those are for field trips and stuff where maybe you can opt out of your kid going, but some of those school fees are for mandatory things like lunch supervision. When lunch is 20 minutes long, you don't have an option for your kid to do anything but stay at school for lunch. Paying, a lot of people mentioned about paying for private supports such as mental health, tutoring, private language classes, and special needs supports as well, which the province has cut funding for in the last few years, or reduced the age, at which children can access these things, basically not past kindergarten, I believe. Um, and then a lot of people commented on the theme of privatization leading to social division and really seeing a negative impact on their communities of children not attending the same schools. 5 families on the block, and they might go to 3 different schools. And also commenting on a lack of diversity within programs of choice. So the fact that people these programs kind of silo people, particularly like some of the faith-based programs. And then there was also, I think some of the teachers within the group commented on privatization within public education. So things like just corporate style management. Sometimes this is just like the management speak that makes its way into what isn't really a corporate structure. Um, Performance-based funding, which we don't actually have in Alberta at the moment, but that was one of the recommendations in the McKinnon report, which I believe came out in 2019 or 2020. That was a blue ribbon panel on Alberta's finances that the provincial government commissioned. And one of the ideas discussed in that report was basically tying funding to school performance, which is a problematic idea from a lot of perspectives, in that it tends to reward schools with high socioeconomic status families already attending there. Um, and then people felt that programs of choice really kind of introduce this pressure to compete among public schools, to compete with other public schools that have programs of choice, and also to compete with private and charter schools. And then the last thing that people noticed was private funding within schools. So, fundraising really being burdensome to parents. Um, Increasingly, fundraising is being used to pay for essentials. People commented on that. So, not things like trips to, you know, Toronto or Montreal or France or wherever, or band trips, which I think a lot of people can get behind, maybe having to do some fundraising for. But fundraising being used to pay for things like laptops or curriculum supports. And people commented that fundraising increases the inequities between schools because, again, schools with wealthier families have more capacity to raise funds. And then a few people brought up this Thrive Elementary sort of philanthropic charter school, which maybe Bridget knows more about than I do. But as I understand it, it was kind of the brainchild of a local car dealership owner who wants to have a school for addressing some of the, it's sort of targeted towards lower income families, but like aspiring to give them, a fair chance. But, there are concerns about this being sort of one person's project.
You want me to go next, Bridget? Can see you looking at me. So question 2 was shared among different participants in, I think, 4 different groups. So the question was, what are some concerns that you have about privatization in your context? And consider who or what is advantaged or disadvantaged. The concerns that we heard about education privatization were various, wide-ranging, as well as deep, in the sense that participants feared that it fundamentally challenged society's foundations. Participants were also worried about the overall lack of oversight in the private sector. And some raised concerns that private schooling may increase narrow-minded thinking as schooling focuses more on what is measured, such as standardized tests. Some participants are also concerned that accountability to the public as a result will decline. And eventually, education privatization would bring forth an increased level of risk to a broader society. Next slide, please. The participants were also raised profound concerns about funding restraints and cuts across associated with education privatization, because it would further mean the loss of public education as the societal, collective, and public good. Participants were also concerned that student interests are and would be increasingly ignored if parents cannot afford the required fees. One participant noted, "My kids can't access their programs of interest without paying for them." Another participant at the cafe also stated, "Many parents can't afford fees." Other participants also noted that some programs were discontinued because of funding cuts. Participants also expressed a feeling of trepidation that schools are being segregated as privatization increases. They have seen that schools are being divided into specialized programs of choice and specific types of schools that cater to particular social, ethnic, and student groups with specific challenges and exceptionalities. They see schools lose diversity as a result of that, and some of them expressed a sense of uneasiness about losing their local schools as a community hub or the community as a village. Some fear that education privatization is leading to intensifying racial, religious, economic, ability-based, gender-based segregation of students and families in the city. The next slide, please. Bridget, next slide. I'm still seeing segregation on mine. And Bridget, you're frozen also. Am I just seeing the same slide? Heather, do you see?
Yeah, I think Bridget
Oh,
is frozen.
it's frozen,
So
Bridget. Oh dear.
she,
Okay, I'll just continue on. The last slide I have about concerns is exclusion. Some participants added that they could see that the select few groups are gaining more advantages in privatized systems of education. Students and families with extra resources, including financial and social capital, have access to and get a better education. Those who fit well in the privatization system seem to be academically motivated or high achieving students who plan to advance to post-secondary opportunities. Some participants also mentioned that racially privileged groups, namely white families, have more options, do well in the context of education privatization. Although some participants noted that a few schools have emerged to cater specifically to racially minoritized families. And most participants raised grave concerns about the students who are not necessarily typical student in the system, about including those with the complex needs, economic poverty, English language learners, refugee needs, among other challenges, including homelessness. participants often viewed that these students were ignored and excluded in the privatizing and privatized education system. So it looks like we are having a bit of technical issues here. And so we are going to switch over to Heather. Do you want to share yours then? You are muted, Heather.
I've got one screen here because I'm on my laptop, so I'm going to try and do this in such a way that I end up sharing my, yeah, okay. Oh, okay. I'm just gonna do that. Okay, sorry. Okay. So, question 3, this is Bridget's slides, so I'll try and do my best for her. And if she is able to rejoin in that time, she can take over again.
I'll try
So
to text her.
question 3 that we asked participants was, what drives your efforts at resisting privatization, and what strategies have or have not worked? And I'm just gonna get rid of, because I realized that okay. So, personal factors were a big one. Lots of people in the room were parents, which I think is certainly speaking for myself, was my own pathway to caring about some of these systemic issues. Um, but there was also, people wanted to make clear that even though that's the pathway for some of us, education advocates are often presumed to be parent advocates. And, you know, um, I think that true education advocates who stick with it beyond sort of their child's particular context really are concerned about education as a collective good, not just sort of my child, my child. And they have a future orientation in mind. So again, beyond their own child's time in the system, they care about education as a public good that should be protected for future generations, and really care about children in that broader social context, and all children, not just their own. Um, Personal character experiences, people are sort of um, oriented towards social good, believing they can maybe make a difference, make some positive change. And people are motivated too by fear and ethical concerns, and there maybe in some cases their own experiences of privatization, if they have perhaps seen that within their public schools, in the ways that we've already talked about. And certainly, I think you have to have a bit of an activist mindset to be in this space. So that was a driver as well. Social and economic factors, again, people do have a sense of obligation to society at large, worried about social division, worried about safety for, students, which, certainly within the last year, some of the policies that have come down since we hosted this event, I think have validated those fears on behalf of some students. Um, Economic factors, people have a range of ideological views on the economy. Um, this is the part where I would,
Heather?
yeah,
Yeah, I am in communication with Bridget. She said that she's almost back and she could continue. Is that
that
okay?
is good because I feel like I'm a little out of my depth here.
I see one question here. Can you discuss more about what on-the-ground organizing leadership looks like in Edmonton? Do you want to talk a little bit about that independent, like the private school? Oh, Bridget is back. Okay, that's good. Go ahead, Bridget.
Do you want to start back at the beginning, Bridget? We kind of covered, um, yeah,
Sure. Give me half a second to get my notes back up here. Um, thanks for being patient.
yeah. So
Um,
I did kind
all
of
right.
go over the personal factors, but then I'm kind of stuck here. So I think you would do much better than I would at this slide.
Yeah, it's probably not going to make a ton of sense. So um, The first personal factor that emerged was probably unsurprisingly to people, parenthood. But despite our common assumption that education advocates are mostly parent advocates, only 5 of our 14 participants specifically named their children as a reason for their engagement. And we can kind of break those responses down into 2 categories. The first one was that parents' comments about their children were often oriented towards their future, either ensuring a good future or expressing fear about that future. So an example of that might be fear for the future of society for my kids. Participants also refer to their children in a broader social context, which one participant described as wanting the best for my kid and all kids, which suggests that public education advocates may have a more pro-social approach, even when motivated by their own children's interests. 4 participants also described factors related to their personal character, values, or experiences. So one was focused positively, talking about their passion for culture building and the public good, seeing their advocacy was a way to use their education, while others expressed fears or concerns about harm. So one described their motivation as coming from a fear of regressive ideas and loss of faith in democratic processes, whereas other people spoke to learning about privatization's harms, including someone who described their personal experiences living in countries with poor education systems. Can we go to the next slide? Great. So some of the main drivers named by participants were social concerns. These are often expressed as a sense of personal obligation. Participants described this feeling that someone needs to care and someone needs to push back and say no. They also described a sense of responsibility. An example statement might be kids/communities/staff who need support in their work, who feel like the adults, governors, systems are letting them down. Another one described this as relieving some pressure and fatigue on our society, allowing people to slow down. As we saw earlier, social divisions were described a lot. People talked about concerns about class stratification, inequity, marginalization, and although they clarified that when they talked about this, they included the need for people from privileged backgrounds to participate in public education. One participant described their desire for public education to serve as a unifier. Seeing polarization in politics and in communities across the country drives me to find a common ground. Privatization was described by others as making communities less safe. And also another concern around safety was that privatization might be denying children autonomy and their right to sex education. Other participants described concerns related to the economy, and their statements reflected a couple of different political orientations toward economic issues. The first one probably reflecting the more common political discourse in Alberta. Some participants approached it through this lens of fiscal responsibility. One participant stated that privatization is wasteful. Others raised concerns about profit-taking in education, noting corporate control of curriculum as a concern. And these positions are relatively mainstream in Canadian politics and may be held by both moderate conservatives and progressives. The other cluster falls broadly under the umbrella of criticisms of capitalism, with one participant describing this as their commitment to equity and belief in anti-capitalist values. This group included fears about class stratification, with one participant remarking that a return to feudalism isn't good for most of us. Finally, I just want to note this emotional aspect to participants' comments. Both positive feelings like efficacy and negative emotions like anger and fear are documented as driving activists engaged in progressive causes. But these different positive emotions have different effects. And so these other oriented positions are actually essential to social movements' long-term success. So next slide. Participants share a number of strategies they felt were effective. Interestingly, there was little emphasis on tactics like lawn signs and letter writing. They were actually only mentioned by one person. Most often, people talked about the importance of connection and collective action, with a heavy emphasis on education advocacy as part of daily life, and many participants talking about how one-on-one conversations are an effective tool, stating things like, speaking about how vital public education is and the fear of what we are facing all the time is my daily life, literally. This also extends to collective action, although interestingly, despite the composition of the group, it was rarely talked about in the framework of formal organizations. The only organization mentioned in all the comments was the Alberta School Councils Association, which is interesting given that many people in the room were part of formal organizations, advocacy groups, labor unions, and it's unclear whether this was because of perceived inefficacy or because this is like the air that advocates breathe. It's ever present, but rarely consciously considered. So instead, people talked about active forms of communication, such as networking events and online forums. And I think this focus holds a promise for a World Cafe style model as a tool for movement building, creating a venue for connection across various groups. So one of the things we heard from several participants at the end of the event was that it was uncommon to sit down with people across the range of education advocacy. They were often speaking mainly to other parents, other teachers, etc. Under personal collective action, people also talked about educating others in both formal and informal ways, like discussing privatization's effects in the teacher education classroom. Third category was direct engagement with the elected officials. Participants were not talking about conventional advocacy tools like petitions or letters. Instead, they talked about active and direct engagement using phrases such as talking with, asking questions, and making explain. One participant also raised the importance of partnering with their school trustees. Electoral strategies did come up, although, as we'll see on the next slide, there was some pretty clear pessimism about politicians' effectiveness. For people still noted that electing pro-public education representatives matters. And finally, people did raise potentially including more choice within the public education system, but they definitely talked about this with some ambivalence over the effects of privatization within the public system. However, people did note that Edmonton Public Schools' decision to implement alternative programs earlier than Calgary probably reduced the number of private and charter schools in Edmonton. But again, the feelings on that were really mixed. And finally, we'll get to what didn't work. Unlike the responses to the earlier questions, these responses were quite united. Some people did express that trying to work within the system had been a failure. However, the strongest theme across the board was that politicians are not able to solve this problem for us. Participants generally felt poorly represented and perceived that politicians are mainly interested in what wins elections, not what's right. While the earlier responses on what works indicate the politicians are not seen as entirely ineffective, participants' responses emphasize that politicians must be driven to act by advocates' direct engagement with them, whether that's through partnership or through pressure.
Okay, phew. That went better than I thought it was gonna go. Okay, so I'm just gonna do a little quick, make a concluding discussion. We would like to thank the Edmonton participants who came out to share their experiences and voices. And their experiences were unique, as well as resonating with the accounts and experiences from those that we've heard in other cities and places across Canada. So watch out for future webinars where we will discuss the experiences of privatization and resistance against it from other provinces and cities. And our event ended with a renewed commitment to building public advocacy across Canada that continues resistance to education privatization.
Great. So now there's a little bit of information about how to learn more about the project and the public education exchange in general. And now we can go to our Q&A section. So if you have a question, at the bottom of the screen, you should see a little box that says Q&A on it if you're in Zoom. And you can go in there and you can type a question in and we will answer them